Hello, my name's Kayvon Sadeghi, and I'm excited to be here with a great panel for our program, Securities Litigation, What You Need to Know About a Rising Tide and an Active Bench. So thank you for joining us. 2017 has been a big year in securities litigation. Plaintiffs are filing more cases. There have been some landmark decisions, and there are more on the horizon. It's also been an active year for the SEC and a year of transition. So we're going to walk you through some of the data on recent trends. We're going to talk about some of the recent developments driving those trends, and we're going to give you a sense of what to look for ahead from the Supreme Court and from the SEC. Before we get into that, I'd like to introduce our panel. Once again, my name's Kayvon Sadeghi, and I'm with Morrison Forrester. Securities litigation and SEC enforcement matters have been a focus of my practice for the last 15 years. I currently sit on the Securities Litigation Committee of the New York City Bar Association, and I'm also a Lexis practice advisor in the space. Starting on the far right here, we have Richard Schoenstein, who is a partner and co-head of his firm's Securities and Financial Services Litigation Group at Tarter, Krinsky & Drogan, which is a leading firm for mid-sized businesses. Over the last 25 years, his practice has covered a wide range of securities litigation as well as other complex business litigation, employment, and other matters. Next to him is Brendan Rudolph of Cornerstone Research. Cornerstone is a leading economic and financial consulting firm to attorneys. They have a deep expertise in securities litigation, and Brendan has consulted on dozens of securities cases, including some of mine. So thank you. And last to my left is Josh Newville. He is a litigation partner at Proskauer Rose, where he handles securities litigation, enforcement, and regulatory matters. Before joining Proskauer, Josh spent 6 years at the SEC in its enforcement division. He served on the SEC's asset management unit, focusing on investment advisors and the asset management industry. So for our program today, as I said, we're going to walk through some data on securities filings. We're going to discuss some of the trends, and then we'll turn to some developments to look for on the horizon. So I think let's dive right in with the data. Cornerstone compiles data on federal securities filings throughout the country and presents an assessment every year that is really essential reading for securities litigation practitioners. We're lucky to have Brendan here to share their analysis and his insights. So with that, I will turn it over to Brendan.
Thank you. Figure this thing out. There we go. So before I dive into the data, just to orient things a little bit and add to the excellent background that Kayvon provided about our firm. So Cornerstone does do quite a bit of expert testimony in securities litigation amongst other practices. And the data that we're going to flip through in a few minutes is a result of our collaboration with one of our experts at Stanford Law School. So set up a clearinghouse with the law school there, and for many years since PSLRA, I've been just collecting data about various attributes of litigation intensity in the securities space. So that's what we'll talk through here. The slides that'll follow are going to hit on all these key points in more detail, but to summarize, 2017 had the highest filings rate on record, so we'll see what that means in a few minutes. Importantly, though, one of the waves, and I guess a trend we'll talk about more later in the presentation, is large influence of M&A filings post-Trulia, but that's not all that accounts for the record rate of filings this first half of this year. A couple other points we'll see empirically. The percentage of listed firms sued is tracking at the highest rate since PSLRA. We'll see again in more detail in a few minutes. And while the number of filings is up, dollar size is not at records. So these tend to be a little bit smaller, medium-sized cases. So jump right into some of the data. I think this chart shows visually the trend that we're talking about here. 226 filings in the first half of 2017 obviously stands out as a record vis-a-vis this history that we're showing here since 2007. It's maybe a little hard to see on the screen, but there's a dashed line around 96 level, which is the semi-annual average going back to 1997. So obviously the simple math, 226 filings is more than double the semi-annual average historically here. And also, as I mentioned, the bars are broken out here. So gray is just your standard, I guess what you'd think of as a classic securities filing. That's 131, so that's also well above the semi-annual average. And if we were to pull out all of the M&A filings, which are shown by the yellow bars here, that 131 level alone would also represent a record. So, the M&A filings, again, 95 of them in the first half, only add to a trend that was, already in place with a record level of filings across all these things. We also show Chinese reverse mergers. I don't think there's much to say about that now. That was a little wave back in 2010, 2011. So if we were having a similar presentation back then, that might be something that people got excited about. But as you see, that wave kind of came and then passed very quickly. I'll also say this M&A filings data, we only started tracking that retrospectively. So it wasn't the case that back in 2010, people were sensing M&A might be a big trend. But once we started tracking that post-Trulia, we kind of worked all the way back and saw what you would characterize as M&A filings at that point in time.
And does that cover just filings in federal court, or is that?
Yes, correct. Good point. So all of these data are federal securities class action filings. Another way to think about the impact of Trulia and the M&A filings is to look at it by circuit. I think typically one would expect the Second and Ninth Circuits to be the largest, comprise the largest share of the filings, and that's what we see in the first half of 2017 as well as historically. I think the one thing that jumps out on this visual is that the Third Circuit is now really neck and neck with the Second and the Ninth, and almost triple kind of its historical rate. So Delaware obviously accounts for a lot of that. So M&A filings in Delaware federal court are one of the things behind a big jump in the Third Circuit. Another thing that I don't know what trend to make of it, but New Jersey filings are up as well. So a lot of pharmaceutical filings in the first half of this year, a lot of pharma firms headquartered in New Jersey. So. And the other circuits kind of tend to be much smaller, obviously, and roughly in line with historical norms. So one other measure of litigation intensity is, I think of this as how likely is it that any company is going to be sued in a given year. So what the visual is showing is the percentage of all listed companies that were sued in these periods. And you can think of it, if the data, for example, in the rightmost bars showing that if things continue in the second half of this year as they have in the first, 9.5% of all listed companies would expect to be sued in a securities filing this year. So 1 in 10 shot, basically, of a company getting sued, which is well outside of the historical norms that we see in the chart here. I think the other interesting thing is that is, of course, driven by the raw number of filings going up. It's also driven very slightly by the number of listed companies going down. So that the heat map on the bottom here shows percentage or number of listed companies in the United States. And in the first half of this graph, 2007 through 2011, it was generally declining. There was a slight increase in the number of listed companies kind of around the middle of the period we're showing here, but this past year the number of listed companies has declined again. So you couple a wave of increased both classical and M&A filings with a slight decrease in the number of total listed companies, and your probability of any company getting sued in the year, as you see, jumps right off the page. So one other thing to note, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is while the raw number of filings is increasing, size of dollar exposure is not. This is a tricky thing to benchmark and measure across hundreds of cases being filed. Each case obviously has its own idiosyncratic allegations. You'd really need to read the complaint and try to understand if there's one corrective disclosure, multiple corrective disclosures, what is the sort of total exposure in that given case. So that's not practical across hundreds of filings. The way that the Stanford team, in collaboration with Cornerstone, does this is two admittedly crude measures, but measures that are benchmarks that you can apply across hundreds of cases rather easily. They're shown on this table here. So maximum dollar loss is taking the issuing company, the company that was sued's maximum share price within the class period, and subtracting the share price at the end of the class period and figuring out what is the maximum market cap lost over the span of the pled class period. Disclosure dollar loss just looks at the market cap lost at the very end of the class period. So if it's a single drop case, that's a pretty good proxy for the damages. If there's multiple drops, a tiered situation, then less so. It's not shown on these charts, but the total amount, if you were to gross up either MDL, maximum dollar loss, or disclosure dollar loss, DDL, over all of the filings in the first half of 2017, that's actually not near a record. So as I mentioned, the total number of filings well out of bounds, an obvious record. If you gross up the potential exposure under either of these measures, it's not out of the norm at all. In fact, the maximum dollar loss is basically right around the historical average. So, more cases being filed, but smaller, medium-sized cases. And then the pie chart at the bottom here kind of shows another way to look at it. Of the pot of all of the cases filed in a given period, how many of those are these so-called mega filings, which we define as maximum dollar loss greater than 10 billion? The left portion of this kind of Pac-Man chart shows historically, those average upwards of 70% of all the filings in a year. So, a given period's filings will be disproportionately skewed towards these mega filings. Looking at the full year of 2016, that they became a slightly smaller portion, and that continued into the first half of 2017, where these mega filings are actually, still the plurality, but not no longer encompassing the majority of all the filings in a given year. And we've just listed what all of the big filings in the first half of 2017 are. These cases might be familiar to some people. Qualcomm is sort of the most in terms of maximum dollar loss, but not so in the case of disclosure dollar loss. And one other interesting trend that is just it's not necessarily a first half of 2017 phenomenon, but has continued over the past few years, is the increasing prominence or influence of Rosen, Pomerantz, and Glancy as firms that are filing these actions. So we can see the percentages of the total classical filings that they've comprised, and it's only been increasing. Another thing that not shown on these slides that might be of interest is another trend that's been increasing over the past many years is that institutional investors, so pension funds, things of that nature, have become the most prevalent lead plaintiff in these filings. Back 7-8 years ago, retail investors or individuals tended to be the most prevalent lead plaintiff. But with these firms filing more cases, that's also been accompanied with more institutional investors as the lead plaintiff in the cases. So we don't have any questions from the group viewing yet. I don't know if the panel has any other.
Sure. Have you noticed if there's any correlation between these particular firms that are sort of a rise in the filings and the smaller cases? Is it that the larger cases are being filed roughly similarly by the same old established players, and these new firms are going after smaller companies or smaller cases? Or
yeah, it's a good question. I think to some extent they are going after, they're going after more small cases. I think a few of them have tried to carve out some of the big blue chip filings, try to get some of that business. But
one other thing I've seen a rise in not just the institutional shareholder plaintiffs, but also the groups of plaintiffs, where they find an investor group of 3 to 5 people to bring the case on, as opposed to just an individual or just the institutions. So,
excellent.
Can I ask on those, on the number of mega filings, whether that's something that's simply driven by whether there's a market correction or not?
Yeah, that's interesting. It tends to be. So certainly the most mega filings, and even if we're thinking about like the total size of the pie, like if you multiply the cases by the or add up the maximum dollar loss across all the cases, it certainly is the case that 2007, 2008 was the peak of that. But interestingly, the first half of 2013 also had a fairly large pie of these things, and also the second half of 2015. So it's a little bit idiosyncratic, but definitely in terms of big waves like the credit crisis, generated quite a lot of activity.